Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for joining the second session of the Governance 101 webinars. My name is Yasin Samim. I am the Senior Program Coordinator for Equity Stream at OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Before we formally begin our today's session, I would like to take a moment to offer a land acknowledgement, not as a formality, but as a recognition of the land we are meeting on today. This land on which OCASI operates, and today we are hosting this virtual event, is the pot of the dish with one spoon treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada treaties. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island. We also commit to deepening our understanding of Indigenous history and building relationship of solidarity through our capacity building initiatives. And now a few words about logistics. Before moving on to the main session, I would like to walk you through a few logistical instructions to ensure a safer and effective individual and collective participation for all of us. First, recording and interaction. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the program's landing page on ocasi.org. Please turn off your camera if you don't want to be recorded. Please keep your audio muted throughout the session. If you need any assistance, send a direct chat message to OCASI support team. Second, chat, questions, and answers. Use the chat feature to communicate with other participants. Please submit your questions only to Q&A box. Our team will monitor your questions and comments. For live questions, please raise your hand. The facilitator will call on you and then unmute and turn on your video if you feel comfortable. Please be considerate and respectful when using chat box and posting your questions. Third, interpretation. This webinar will be conducted in English. There will be simultaneous French interpretation. To select your language, choose the interpretation option at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you see the globe icon. A warm welcome to our excellent team of interpreters, Mercedes and Janetsa. Now, join me to welcome our training facilitator for today's webinar, Sonia Nerat. She will provide more details on her background, and you also can find her bio in the chat box. Over to you, Sonia.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Very good to be back for this second session of the Governance 101 training. I'm just going to share my screen now. One moment. Okay, everyone can see. Well, welcome. I'm not sure how many people were here 2 weeks ago for part one of the governance training. My name is Sonia Narad. I have a long history in the nonprofit space, more than 30 years, I guess, in total. For 15 of those years and more, I've worked directly in the community, primarily focused in community health, housing, homelessness, and the immigrant refugee sector. And for 15 years, I've been consulting, and much of my consulting is with boards of directors and leadership teams because I tend to focus on strategic planning. I will try to bring as much of my expertise as I can today, and you're welcome to ask as many questions as you want. We won't get to all of them today because we only have so much time and because our focus is governance and we're not drilling down areas such as fundraising or strategic planning as much as we want to, but happy to answer questions and get back to you after this workshop if I can. So please put everything that you want in either the chat or the Q&A. Everything will be monitored. And we are a big group. I wish we could be a little bit more interactive. We'll do our best. I'm going to stop at many points in time this morning to ask you questions. We won't be able to hear, obviously, from everybody, but the intention is to ask you questions so that we can all start thinking about our organizations and our boards, and our current state and opportunities for the future. So I will be posing these questions. You can answer them right away in the chat. I'm happy to take a couple of live question responses as well, and take and track the questions, of course, so that you have them for your reference and you can reflect on them after this workshop has ended today. To get us started, please take a minute, drop your name and your organization in the chat so that everybody else here today can see who's with us. And as I asked last week, what's your burning governance question? Why have you showed up today? What have you been thinking about? And we'll hopefully answer the question throughout our 2 hours together, or I may have an opportunity to respond to your question after the workshop has ended, through the follow-up um, presentations and Q&A that we provide to everybody. All right, so hopefully people have gotten a few things into the chat, and we'll get going. All right, so for today, our objectives are similar in some ways to last time. We're here because we want to improve our knowledge and our understanding about board governance and how to practice effective board governance. We're going to take a deeper dive today in terms of roles and responsibilities of boards as a collective and of individual board directors regarding different governance functions. And I'm providing a number of tips and tools throughout the workshop that hopefully will be takeaways for you, that you can start to apply right away as board members or with your boards. Oops, sorry, I'm having trouble. So a quick recap for people who attended last time. You heard what the role of a board of directors is, your ultimate purpose, that is, your ultimate mandate is to ensure your organization's success and your organization's sustainability. Those are two different things, connected for sure, but different. And as the board, this is your job, right? Even though you may be larger and have an ED or a CEO or lots of staff, fundamentally, and at the end of the day, it is the board that is in this that has this role of responsibility for these two particular factors. So how do we ensure success? We talked a little bit about it last week. And today we're going to spend a bit more time focused on this. So it's a lot about policies and practices. This is at the heart of the board's work. I'll just get them all up here and then we'll go through them. So policies and practices in general that promote an organization's long-term success, needing to make sure you're in compliance with all relative legislation and regulations, needing to clarify and be crystal clear about the board's role as a whole and what the individual director's duties are. Policies and practices that are going to promote good board quality, and that's about the quality of the people at the table and the quality of the work that you do as a board. Policies and practices that foster a healthy board culture. I think we probably all can agree that the last thing we want at board meetings or in our organizations is conflict or tension or behaviors, right, that are not fair, that are inequitable, that do not reflect our values as organizations. Policies and processes, really important, that support the board and the CEO or the ED to perform as a really strong and cohesive team where both parties understand their unique roles and responsibilities, and those are respected. So we may understand them, we don't always respect them. It's really important that we respect our unique roles and responsibilities. And then finally, policies and practices that protect your mission, protect your reputation. And really important, that is over and above anybody's individual reason for being at the table, right? So we're focused on our organization, and our policies and practices reflect that. So that's about success. Sustainability, a little bit different. So here, our policies and practices, are about fund or resource development and planning for the future. And increasingly, boards are more engaged in this work than perhaps they used to be, or perhaps that they're comfortable with, depending on the kind of board that it is. And so, what do these policies and practices look like? Sound financial monitoring and planning. This is about your financial reports, your financial policies. Fund or resource development planning. So having a vision for the future and really strong clarity about your resources, where they're going to come from, what your options are over the years. Having diverse revenue streams and trying to really work hard to move beyond dependency on maybe one particular type of funding. Um, Increasingly engaging in philanthropy. And philanthropy is a mindset as much as it is an activity. It's a mindset. It means that everybody in the organization is participating in resource development in some way, not the same way, but in some way, and involved in maximizing their connections and their skills and their expertise to bring revenues into the organization. Maintaining a reserve, I know, really difficult depending on the size of your organization, but really important. And then finally, as a board, more than anybody else in the organization, it is your job to really be thoughtful about the future and think about partnerships and integration as a strategy to maintain the services and supports that your organization delivers. And we'll get into all of this in detail, a little bit more detail as we go through this workshop. So to recap, last time we talked about core governance functions, and I talked about the model of leadership governance, which includes 3 areas of focus for boards: fiduciary, strategic, and generative. And 3 of those coming together to create the strongest board possible. And through that model, a board carries out its functions, right? And these are the 8 core functions: approving strategy, monitoring performance, monitoring quality and effectiveness, overseeing finances, overseeing risk, supervising the ED or the CEO, maintaining or overseeing all of your important relationships, and finally, looking after the board and managing the board. And I think maybe we do 1 through 7 as boards, and we kind of forget about number 8, or not forget, but it doesn't seem as important because it's about us, right? And so today we're talking about managing the governance of the board in much more detail and specificity. So a framework for good governance. What are the things that a board, how can a board structure itself? What does it need to look at? I went through all those policies and processes that should be in place for success and for sustainability. Here we're breaking it down into these 4 areas. So board role. Under board role, we talk about the board's responsibility, its functions, and how it carries those out, what the nature of the board is, where it's involved, where it isn't involved. Then we talk about the duties of specific directors and ensuring there's clarity around that. And then finally, this is about the board's role and relationship vis-a-vis the ED or the CEO or the lead staff in the organization. The second area of this framework is board quality. And this is about the size, the composition of the board, what your terms look like, what renewal processes involve, Your recruitment, your orientation, your development or education of board members sits in here, and really important feedback and evaluation, and ensuring that there's a constant process involved in soliciting and acting on board member feedback. Then getting into structure. This is where we want to ensure that we have committees, we understand what the role of our committees is, and we have officers, and the role of those officers are also really clear, and that we've established sound meeting processes. And then finally, culture is our fourth area of focus in this framework, and it's where we pay attention to relationships and dynamics and norms. So I'll break all of these down, and we'll pause for questions as we go through each of these areas. So our first area in the framework, board role, what we're looking at here in terms of policy. So I said policy a lot of times. I hope each of you are thinking about your policy manuals. They may not be written on paper, they may be virtual or in a shared drive somewhere, but I hope all of you are thinking about your board policies. So have you articulated your governance process in your board policies? Have you written down what the board's style and commitment is? Have you written down very explicitly what the board of directors' responsibilities and obligations are? Have you covered term and attendance? And are you clear about the board's role with respect to the ED and or the CEO or staff? So those are the core policy areas we want all boards to have in place as part of a good governance framework. I'm gonna propose a couple of tools or tips for you in this area. Um, so first one, I know I'm not sure how many people we have at the table here, actually. I haven't looked. Yes, we have about 60 people at the table. I'm sure your organizations well, you're all unique organizations, and perhaps some of you are newer organizations and some of you are very established. Some might be very small, some might be very large. And you may be located in all different parts of Ontario or nationally. And our boards are all very different. So there are boards that are newer, small, informal, and looking at the left side here, structure and operations, they function very differently than perhaps boards that have been around for a long time, where the organization is established, and people are bringing a lot of governance expertise and skill to the table. So if we are newer, and there's nothing wrong with any of these types of boards, but the important part is that you understand where you sit, and that you have articulated really clearly roles, responsibilities, relationships, so that everybody is understanding the board in the same way. So if we are a board that's very focused on, that's very new, informal, voluntary, your focus is going to be more on your structure and day-to-day operations. You may be delivering the organization's work and services. So the qualities you're going to be looking for in a board member are people who do have time to spend working and delivering services and doing the work of what might be staff work in organizations that are more established, more structured, and larger. And if you are one of those larger organizations, your board members' focus is governance, and you're looking more for people who have those strong policy skills, those planning skills, that experience with really looking into the future and positioning organizations for the future. If you're new and trying to keep the lights on, you may not have that capacity. You may in the future, but maybe not today. So your board over on this side, you're focused on the day-to-day. Over on the governance side, you're really strategic. Often when we're focused on structure and operations and we're newer, our board members tend to be the founders, right? They're the people who started the organization. And then as we become established, our board changes. And really important, none of your board members may have been around at the beginning, but it is really important that they're connected to the organization, its mission, right? And its mandate and its purpose. And so as a board needing to put in place structures that enable that. Usually these boards that are still developing, they're working as a whole, they don't have a lot of capacity. The work tends to get done at those board meetings. And then as you get more formal and structured, your committees become quite important and are performing a lot of the work of the organization. Fundraising, usually lots of events for newer organizations as opposed to government funding and grants and foundation funding. And then as you become more structured and transition into a governance board, you really are looking at grants and funders and a donor strategy. And then, of course, staffing, starting with maybe no staff at the beginning, and then slowly staff that are more serving the board at the beginning, because the board is really the founders of the organization and know what the organization's mission and vision and purpose is. And over time, the staff may be really supporting the board and shaping the board's work. And then as we move into governance, back to more serving the board, because the focus of the staff really is operations. Okay, a couple more here, and then I've got some questions for you. So think about your own organizations. I just covered a lot there. How would you describe your governance model? When you're recruiting new board directors, do they get information about the governance model? Do they know what they're walking into and where your organization sits in this framework? Okay, think about that for a few minutes. Anybody want to talk about whether they've done work articulating their governance model or reflecting on their governance model or changing, right? Anyone that's been through a transition in terms of their governance? I'll leave it to my colleagues at OCASI to see if there's any questions.
Hi, Sonia. I wanted to double check and I will ask the question first and then you can let me know if you will touch on the subject later down the line.
Sure.
What indicators or benchmarks do you use to assess whether governance practices are translating into measurable community impact rather than simply organizational compliance?
Okay, great. Yeah, we will get into it for sure.
Okay. The next one is more about responsibilities and organizational policies.
Okay.
They would like a deeper understanding of how a board should fulfill its responsibilities related to organizational policies, legislative compliance, and governance structures, particularly when these frameworks are being developed or implemented within new and young organizations, such as those that are emerging in councilmen. So how can boards ensure accountability and effective oversight during these early stages of growth?
Okay, so hopefully I'm going to get into it as I start to move through some of these next slides. So keep those questions in mind, and we'll bring them back to the forefront if we haven't answered them in the presentation.
Okay.
Anything else, or should I keep going?
I think you can keep going.
Okay, great. So great question. So, and we don't need to answer today, but it's for you. These are all takeaway questions. Are your board directors familiar and up to date with all of the relevant legislation and regulations in your particular jurisdiction? And depending on where you're incorporated, really important to understand either ONCA, the Ontario nonprofit legislation, or the Canadian nonprofit legislation, and I'll cover that in a few slides. Okay, So I talked a lot already about board role responsibilities related to your staff, right? Which in terms of the board, your staff, as we discussed last time, is the executive director, the CEO. Typically, you have one staff that you're responsible for. And it is really important to have the best relationship possible with that staff. That's how you can be a really strong, high-performing team. And so one of the ways that boards can ensure that that relationship is working is by establishing what some people call executive limitations policy, executive constraints policy. They're the same thing. What they do is identify what the CEO or the ED or the highest staff in the organization can do that's within their scope, within their role, within their responsibility, within their decision making uh, in terms of these different areas. So asset protection and risk management. What is the ED's role in that area? Where can they make decisions without checking in with the board? And where do they need to check in with the board? And that might be things like if you own a facility, is the ED or the CEO able to make decisions about that facility, property, real estate without checking in with the board? When do they check in? When do they not? So that's an example of asset protection. Risk management. I talked last time about a risk register and risk management policies. So often within those policy frameworks, the accountabilities of the ED and the board get spelled out. So are these in place in your organizations? Annual budgeting. What is the ED's role responsibility when it comes to annual budgeting? When do they defer to the board? And I'll go through this in a second. Financial planning, conditions, and activities. What can the ED do without checking in with the board? Communication and counsel. When does the ED communicate? When do they not need to communicate with the board? When do they need to get the board's advice or not? Planning. What's within the ED's role responsibility? What's within the board's? And I'm asking questions because there isn't always one answer to these questions. There's all sorts of templates and tools which I can share. At the end of the day, you sit down with your organization and you determine where you're at as an organization and how wide the scope or birth of your ED is. Compensation and benefits. Does the ED set that for all the staff? Does the board need to set it for anybody or not at all, only for the ED? Succession, is it the ED's responsibility to plan succession for all the staff roles, including their own? Does the board plan for the ED's succession? So you need to articulate this in policy. Funder and community relations, does the ED is the ED the spokesperson for in all situations with everybody? When does the board chair step into these relationships? Treatment of employees. Typically, ED is the direct line to the employees, and any relationship with the staff goes through the ED and not to the board directly. So that's really important to articulate that in policy. And similarly with volunteers and students. So that's a table of contents, perhaps, for your executive limitations policy. And really important to put that in place. Here's a little bit of how sometimes organizations will think about duties of the board and their committees and their ED. And I'll just highlight a couple of these. Again, all of this will be shared with you later. So finance. The board approves the budget, right? However, it's the ED, as you can see down at the bottom. Oh, I'm so sorry. That prepares that budget for the board's consideration and review. It may go to the treasurer first if there's a treasurer in the organization, or it may go to the finance committee first if there's a finance committee. All of this would be articulated in your finance policies. In terms of ED relations, you may have a governance committee that carries out a review of the executive director, and they make a recommendation to the board about compensation, for example. It is, however, the board as a whole, and I can't stress enough uh, as we go through our content today, that boards make decisions. Committees typically don't make decisions. They make recommendations to the board. So our governance committee may conduct a performance review and may make recommendations to the board. However, it's the board that would make the final decision around a particular ED's compensation, for example. A few more here. Yeah, the board approves an auditor. That's not for your executive director to decide. A board is responsible for making sure that it's insured. It's not the ED's job to make sure that that's in place. Strategic plan. It is the board's job to make sure that a strategic plan is developed and that we have goals and that we have metrics. It is the ED's job, however, to implement, right? And then work with the board to make sure that the organization has the resources that it needs to implement that plan. It's the ED's job to evaluate the employees and evaluate the work of the organization. However, it's the board's job to make sure that there's systems and structures and processes in place for that to happen in a consistent way, thinking about your HR policies. The ED typically is going to prepare all of your funding proposals. However, it may be signing officers or boards who do approvals. That'll depend on your financial policies or the funder. They may have their own policies. So just a summary around this whole section: boards and EDs and roles and responsibilities. Micromanagement on the part of a board can lead to a lot of conflict and a lot of confusion and a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety regarding roles and responsibilities. And we may not always be aware, right? So if a staff reaches out to a board member because they're having a problem and they want to chat with you and you're a good person, right? And you want to be helpful, intuitively we want to reach out and be of service to that staff person, and you can't as a board member. It is your responsibility to refer that staff person to back to the ED or to follow the policies and procedures that are in place in the organization related to conflict management or a complaint process or whatever the case may be. So really important that boards and board members are respecting the chain of command, lines of communication in an organization. So that's a pretty frequent one. Boards of directors editing documents. So your ED may be preparing funding reports and they may be preparing communications for some of their partners or stakeholders, and they share those documents with the board because it's important for you to know what's going on in the organization. Often, I've been in situations where the chair or somebody who loves writing wants to just start editing those documents, right? And takes on what is really the ED's role. So really important that you pay attention to back to what your roles and responsibilities are as board members. And then board meetings. We talked about this last time, like really making sure that you shape your board meetings so that you have time dedicated to important conversations and not to tasks or decisions that are the responsibility of the ED. And it's really easy for us to get into the weeds for sure. It's often concrete, right? The business of the ED. So it's something that the boards like to get into, but it is important to stay focused on what is within the board's scope when it comes to decision making and activities, and leave the ED's work to the ED. All right. So let me pause there again just to see if there's any question regarding the executive limitations policy. If people don't have that, is that something new? Any questions related to that?
We did have a hand raised from Jenny Lee. So, Jenny, I don't know if you want to ask your question.
Hi. Um, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. We have an operation manual policy that also embedded some of the board's responsibility in there. My question is it wise to have them operational separate than the board manual or the board policy?
Yeah. I've worked with organizations that embed their governance policies in their operational manuals. I'm not sure why. I like governance policies to sit alone, right? And operations to be about operations, and HR may be within operations, or it may be distinct as a third area of focus, and finance as an area of focus. I think especially if we're working with in clouds and in with folders and shared drives, it's not difficult to create different folders, right? So you have your governance policies, your operations policies. At the end of the day, the most important thing is that they're there, they exist, that they're up to date, and that people know them, know about them, have read them, understand them, and practice them. So that's in some ways that's more important than whether they're all combined in a big policy manual.
And do I need to share the operation manual with the board? I don't think so, right?
You don't need to. However, I think as an FYI, it can help a board to understand how an organization functions.
All right, thank you.
But it's really clear, right? This is FYI. It's not necessarily for the board to get into developing operational protocols.
Thank you.
Next question is the executive limitations policy. They're just asking if anyone has a sample that they can look at.
Yeah. Oh, definitely do not reinvent the wheel. Use your networks. These policies are out there. They exist. You do need to, for sure adapt them to the context of your organization.
I think that's it for now. There was a question about board compensation.
Yeah, good question. I didn't actually put a line about that anywhere. In your conflict of interest policies, there should be a very clear statement that says your boards do not are not compensated for their time as board members. That is something that is prohibited. And then you have gift giving policies, which again, I'll get into it in a few minutes. Usually that's covered off in your conflict of interest policy as well. Um, Especially if you're in service delivery. I know I worked in healthcare for a long time and we got lots of chocolate at Christmas. These are gifts that in your gift giving policy you can say are okay to accept. However, you should articulate where there's a limitation, right? And what kinds of gifts will not be accepted and what you will do when those kinds of gifts are received by the organization. You may donate them, right, to charity or have a different process for dealing with those instances. I'll keep going. Yeah. All right. Board quality. So this is a really big area of focus where, again, this is about policy and procedures and having these really clearly articulated. Often, a lot of this content is in your bylaws as an organization. So, for the board to articulate its policies in terms of its governance policies, it may not be a lot of additional work because you're lifting from your bylaws, and definitely make sure that these policies are consistent with what's in your bylaws. When we're looking at board quality, as I mentioned earlier, this is about ensuring that the people sitting around the board table have the skills and the competencies and the information and the knowledge that they need to do their work in the best way possible. So we want to articulate what our board member composition looks like, and that's about the number of board members. That's about the skills that you may want to be having at the table. For example, one person with legal expertise or human resources expertise, or if you're involved in I don't know, housing, you may want to have somebody from a housing background. You may want to have people with nonprofit expertise. So the board would spend some time thinking about the kinds of skills it needs at the table and put those embed those in your policies related to board member composition and requirements. You want to have policies and processes that talk about how you recruit people and how you select people. And so, for example, do you have a governance committee? Is that the committee that's responsible for board member recruitment? Or do you strike a committee, a working group, a time-limited committee, 6 months before your AGM, and they sit down and they look at what the board needs and who we need to recruit and how we're going to select those people. So there's lots of different ways to work through how you're going to recruit people. The important part, again, is to write down the policies and the processes. How do you select a board member? Is there a standard process in terms of we create a slate, we interview them, we have a scoring, right? A scoring guide, a scoring process, and we bring our preferred candidates to the board, and the board approves the preferred candidates before we go before our general membership. All of that, again, there isn't necessarily one right way to do it. The important thing is to write it down so that it happens in a consistent, in a fair, in a transparent way. Board member orientation and mentoring. So once your board members are approved, how does orientation happen? Does it start before they go to the AGM and before they're elected, so that when they get to the first meeting, they're prepared, they have a good understanding of the organization? Do you have a mentoring process where you have a board member who's assigned to support a new board member with their questions and with their experience? Again, no one correct answer. However, ensure that you have everything written down so that it can happen in a smooth way as possible. Board member terms and succession planning. So how long does a board member stay in their role? And I talked last time that you have options. It's not, in my experience, not typical to have only one term. Often 2 terms is more standard, sometimes 3, and in most cases, a space between the second and third term. So the first 2 terms may be consecutive. You may have to go away for a year and come back for a third term. Again, as long as you have it written down and it's very consistently practiced and it's transparent and it's fair, that is the most important part. It would be important, though, to think about staggering your board so that not everybody leaves at the same time, because you do want to have a really strong board succession plan, especially for your executive positions, right? And you want to support a member to become an executive, and then your co-chair or your vice president to be supported into the president role. And then ideally, you want to also make sure that your president sticks around for a year after their executive term is up. So all of that articulated in process so that the board members know how that's going to operate. Midterm vacancy and succession planning, also really important to clarify. There's not one right answer. Having it on paper is the most important part. Former employees or clients who are seeking to be board members. Really important to write down what the rules are related to that. And some boards have very strict rules that that's not possible for different reasons. Others, it's absolutely okay, but that you have to be away from the organization for a year or 2 years. If you're an employee. For other organizations that are very committed to community engagement, community participation, being clear about how clients can become board members is important. Can you Can you receive services and be a board member? If so, how do you address conflict of interest? How do you establish really good boundaries? So again, there's no right or wrong answer. It is important, however, to make sure that your policies and procedures are really clear for everybody. Board self-evaluation. How does the board monitor itself? Do you do a survey at the end of every meeting? Do you do a circle at the end of every meeting to get people's feedback? Do you do an annual survey and develop a plan based on those results? And then board development. Does everybody here have a schedule of learning opportunities that are part of the board's meetings? Do you have learning goals that you've articulated that you're going to pursue over the next year as a board? Do you have at least one governance workshop a year for your board? Okay, so these are really important to be, again, articulating this in your policies. So a couple of questions, and people can share. How does your board know that it's got the right board members at the table? Do you have some particular policies or practices that you use? Who'd like to share? And how does your board, what does your board need to learn to help make sure that every board member is contributing their best? So would love to have people share their experiences or their practices so that you can hear from each other.
All right, we have a few themes from the
Yeah.
questions, and this relates to getting the right people on the board.
Mm-hmm.
So they have Mildred has said that they have 3 board members and one is the CEO. And they want to hire people as everyone with working with us are volunteers.
Yeah.
And then another question is a challenge has been finding board members who can take minutes and find time to write up the minutes and send them out. Wonder if others also experience this challenge and how do they address it? So do you rotate who takes the minutes so it isn't a burden for the secretary?
So what was the first part of the question where there's 3?
The first one was they have 3 board members and they want to, I guess, know how to bring on people, more board members.
Yeah.
I will ask Mildred if you want to provide more detail on that question or comment.
Hello everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. I was just saying that in our board we are 3 people, and I am the CEO. So we want to hire employees because everybody working with us are volunteers. So
Mm-hmm.
we have a coordination of 8 people, but they are all volunteer based. So it is not sustainable. We
Yeah.
want to have a model that is sustainable long term, that they are hired and they are being paid for their work.
Yeah.
So we can guarantee that all our policies are in place and in the long term implemented, because uh, we do orientation for the volunteers, but then for some reasons they move forward in their lives and then they leave the organization, so we have to do it again. And it doesn't seem like we are advancing in that way, because every time somebody gets out of the organization we are back to a square one kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm working with an organization right now. They do have 2 staff. However, the board is very involved in service delivery, and they have made a strategic, they've been established for a while. So they're not brand new, but they've always been very volunteer based. And the board has been an operational board. And they've decided that they do, because the volunteer base is aging, they have way more responsibility as an organization. They have made a decision that the board needs to function and focus on governance, and they need to look at their staffing needs and requirements and model and do two things. So the board needs to develop itself, and it needs to be very creative about where it recruits from, how it's structured so that it can retain board members. And I think I mentioned this last time about being very creative and open to change, right? As a board, in order to attract and retain volunteers. And this is about will you change your meeting times and your meeting hours? Will you use all of the technology that's available? Will you recruit students and young people? And if so, how will you accommodate their deep needs, which might be different? So that board is really focused on transitioning to a governance board and finding people who have the governance skills. And then at the same time, they're focused on hiring staff to run the organization properly. The important thing is it's not going to happen overnight. So they're doing this over 3 years. That's the focus of the next 3 years, is for them to develop governance and develop the right staff for their organization. And everything is really dedicated to that because they want long-term sustainability. And they know that that means they're not necessarily going to focus on other things for a while, like programming and service delivery. But that's what they've decided to do. So again, for every organization, it's different, and you often have to make some challenging decisions if you're going to invest in building either your board or your staff team. So, and then Isabel, what was the second question or second?
It was about determining who takes the minutes. They just wanted some input on is finding board members who want to take the minutes. And do you develop a rotating system so that it's not just the burden is on the secretary?
Yeah. I'll talk in a minute about your executive positions, and the secretary would be responsible for. So again, this is about the size of your organization. The secretary isn't necessarily responsible for taking the minutes. They're responsible for documentation and making sure that the organization's documents are meeting all the legislative requirements, are available, are accessible, etc. You may assign the minute taking to a staff if you have one. You may rotate. You may use AI, right? At the end of the day, though, the secretary is responsible for making sure those minutes exist and that they're accurate and that they are available. Any other questions, Isabella?
None related to this specific topic, so you can continue.
All right, we'll keep going. So board member recruitment, we talked about this already a little bit. Let's get into a bit more information here. It's really, really important, as I've already mentioned, for boards to have a well-articulated and a robust recruitment and onboarding process. And in particular, it's important to know what your legislation is regarding board members. And why I'm talking about this is because last time at the last session 2 weeks ago, there were a number of questions about conflict and holding boards accountable and just ensuring, right, that you have a really good board in place. So in Ontario and in Canada, a board is not able to directly remove a director if they're not happy with that director. We have a process that we need to follow, and in both of these jurisdictions, board members, board directors are only able to be removed by the members of that organization. So this is one really important reason that you spend the time as a board recruiting the right people for your organization so that you're as confident as you possibly can be that you've made the right decision. And also you focus on onboarding and orientation so that every new board member understands what the rules are, what the code of conduct is, how they're expected to behave. And I'll go into open and closed membership in a minute. We talked about that last time. So the removal of board members in terms of our legislation is the same whether you have an open or closed membership. And just a few points about relevant legislation or regulations. ONCA, the Not-for-Profit Corporations Act in Ontario, does have some requirements related to board size, so 3 directors. However, I'm working with a board of 3 right now, and I can say it is a huge burden to have 3 people take on the responsibility of a board. And you can see there that between 5 and 11 is more suitable. You do have then the resources to carry out all of those governance functions and responsibilities that we've been talking about the last 2 weeks. A little bit more about the membership of the organization. So over here, we talked about your directors. Really important to have strong recruitment and onboarding for your directors because it is a challenge, right? At the end of the day, if things don't work out. And then in terms of membership, so one of the things that again it's often articulated in your bylaws, so make sure you're extremely familiar with your bylaws as board members about how decisions are made. And is it majority plus 1? Is it a majority of those present? Is it a majority of all members? All of this has to be really, really clear for the board when they move into any decision-making process. As I mentioned earlier, you can have an open or a closed membership as a board. That is your decision to make as an organization. And so many boards are choosing to be closed, which is when the directors and the members are the same people. Others do remain open, and that open can still come with some criteria, right? We're an open board, however, you need to live in this community, or you need to I don't know, have this particular skill or qualification. But you're an open board, and so that's important anytime that there's a vote in the organization, that you understand who's voting and who's not voting. And then in terms of back to legislation and my suggestion that people are really familiar with legislation, ONCA and same with the Canadian regulations, they do afford members some specific rights. So you may have a nominations process in place in your organization where you've put a lot of work into recruiting members that meet your needs, and your boards approve them. At the end of the day, we can have members coming from the floor, right? If you have an open membership. And these are some of the reasons why organizations make decisions to either be open or closed. One of those is to be more in control of the decision making and board decisions. All right, I'll stop here. I've seen some stuff go in the chat, but should we pause and take any more questions?
Chat. None right now. Specifically, let's see. This is a great question. Does it still have to go by vote if they haven't been attending 3+ meetings?
The board, like whether the board is going to do something about a board member that hasn't attended meetings? Is that the question?
I will call on Miriam to provide a little bit of context.
Thank you.
Hi, Sonia. Yeah, my question is if they haven't been attending meetings, like we've had this in the past where, we've had board members just not attend. You don't hear, responding to emails, messages, etc. So does that mean we still have to take it to a vote, or is there somewhere where we can have that implemented if you don't attend 3+ meetings that you're off the board?
It depends, right? So it depends if you're open or closed.
Mm-hmm.
as an organization. If you're closed, then your directors are going to vote, are going to have the vote, right, on everything. And then it depends on your where's our slide on um, not board quality. Where is
Our
it?
membership is semi-open. So I
Okay.
don't know if how
Okay.
we can answer
So,
that.
yeah, so policy areas, do you have an attendance policy, right?
We don't.
Articulated. So
No.
that's a problem, right? Because then how do your board members know what the rules of the game are?
Mm-hmm.
If it's not written down anywhere that there's an expectation that they attend every meeting, or that they notify the chair if they're going to miss a meeting, or that the chair is going to ask them to provide a reasonable explanation if they miss two or more meetings. And this is what qualifies as a reasonable explanation. So from my perspective, of course, if somebody's not attending, it does not seem right. However, if you do not have rules that clarify that it's not right,
Yes.
it's irrelevant in some ways. So that certainly is the first step, is to get some rules in place regarding attendance. And who's responsible for following up? It's usually the chair who would be responsible for following up with a board member if they're not attending meetings. If you do have policies and they say 3 meetings, no show, no good reason, no leave of absence granted, right? Then um, the chair can do, I guess, a couple of things. First, ask the person to resign. Like, clearly this is not working out for you. We're suggesting you resign from the board, and they say, yes, that's great. That's the best way. Or we're going to have to ask our membership um, to vote on a motion to remove the member from their role. If the membership is closed, then the directors are voting, and probably it'll be straightforward. If you have an open membership, it becomes much more complicated, because your membership does need to approve the person not returning or being removed from their role. And the director does have legal options in terms of challenging the removal.
This is really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so if you do have an open membership and you need to go to this is like the worst case scenario, right? And you need to go to them to remove somebody, at least when you have a policy that says, this is our policy and the policy has clearly been broken and we're asking you to help us have a functioning board, and this is what we're asking. Like, you can argue that, right? Much better with your members if you have an open membership. When you don't have that background and foundation to support you, it becomes a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you so much.
Okay, let's get back to where we were. Other questions here?
None related to this specific topic.
Okay, excellent. I will say, like, in terms of membership, this has been my experience. I've worked in organizations where staff were very, very close to members and could very much influence members regarding a vote. So for an ED and for the board, your member relations is really important, right? And having as many policies and processes in place to manage how decision-making happens in the organization in order to protect the organization from undue influence is really important. And knowing who within your membership has a powerful voice, right? And managing those relationships is really important work for the board, and potentially for the ED or the CEO to do. I don't know if there's others who've been in those situations, right, where the members have made like board AGMs difficult, right? Because of requests or challenges from the floor. I'll move on. Okay. A little bit more about quality. And this is about learning and development. So the quality of governance that was sufficient to get your organization where it is today will be insufficient to get you where you need to be tomorrow, which is all about learning, right? Constant learning, constant improvement, constant change. And therefore, very important, as we noted in our quality policies, to have a section in your governance policies related to board development and board education. And that starts with recruitment and onboarding, of course, and that the board right from the get-go is responsible for the quality of the directors that it is bringing into the organization. But you can't depend on that, right? The information that we have today is going to need to be different from the information we're going to need tomorrow to really govern our organizations. So education, the board should be investing in governance education, at a minimum, one governance focused workshop or session a year. You structure your board meeting in a way that you have an hour dedicated to governance, or you take a Saturday and you meet for 3 hours and you do something more detailed related to governance. And I would suggest that's the bare minimum. I talked 2 weeks ago about having being a generative board and leaving time in your agendas to do work that is about your organization and positioning for the future and really understanding your environment and what's impacting you. And so having room in your agendas to talk about issues on a regular basis is all about educating the board to be as strong as it can be in terms of enabling the organization's success and sustainability. So if you're in an organization that's focused on immigrants and refugees, what does the changes in our legislation that have rolled out over the last year mean to our organizations, and having a really good, strong education session on that. It might be about having education sessions related to housing or food security, all of the issues that are impacting your organizations, or fundraising, whatever your board decides is important to the future of your group. Formal evaluation. And so ideally here you want to be able to evaluate the board's work, the board members' individual experience as board members, and that can be done through all sorts of different processes. I mentioned like formal surveys or check-ins at the end of every meeting. The chair is a really important role. I don't think we can stress enough how important that role is in an organization, and that role should be checking in with directors on at least an annual basis to get feedback on their performance, and importantly to also understand what directors are experiencing and what their expectations are for the future and how they might want to be involved in succession within the board, etc. And then development and succession planning. And again, I recognize different organizations have different capacity. However, being able to ask board members to think about what they want their experience with the board to look like over a few years is important, and it will help with the succession plan. And I think when I don't know if it was Miriam or Mildred who was talking about their board members leaving or volunteers leaving, treating a volunteer like we would treat a staff, and really right from the beginning, sitting down and talking about their expectations for the role and how we can use their skills and their qualifications and their interests to contribute to the organization, and then checking in against that in a regular basis can help to keep people engaged and motivated because you're tapping into their interests and their expectations. So board development, a really important part of the board managing itself. And in terms of a survey, this is an outline for a survey, what the potential areas you may want to be assessing if you are doing a survey. So people, so you would be asking the board members, do we have the right people on the board? Do they bring the right skills? Are we missing skills? Is our board structured the right way? Do we have like the right committees? Do we have the right executive members? Are we meeting at the right time? Are agendas structured in a way that enables us to do the work that we need to do as an organization? Culture, really important. Are we embodying leadership, right? In the way that we behave and present ourselves as a board? Is our culture healthy? Is it reflective of our values? Are the dynamics working? Are we engaged in authentic conversation, or are we really not able to voice the things that we need to voice as a board? Very important, the work, right? Is the board carrying out its mission, vision, strategic directions, and how do we know? Can we make improvements in that area? Do people have ideas about funding or our image? Do we have enough information about programs and finances? And is the CEO board relationship working? Do we need to make improvements there? So that's the third area of focus for our survey. And then impact. And does the board feel that the organization is having an impact on the organization? So is the board, right, helpful? Is it contributing to the organization's performance, and how is it doing that? So these are the areas that you may want to talk about these in some way at every meeting on an annual basis to take some time, conduct a survey, and get really good feedback, and then not put that on a shelf, right? Use that to identify priority areas of focus or improvement for the board and structure a board development or a board improvement plan that is going to help to address some of the areas that were identified either as weaknesses or limitations in the survey, or as areas of opportunity, right? Areas that people are excited to pursue. All right, let me stop there. Questions, board self-assessments, surveys. Do people have these processes in place? Are they working in your organizations?
Do have several questions, but not related to this specific topic.
Do you want to hold them till the end and we can just have more of a
Yes.
Q&A? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's
Okay,
do
everybody,
that.
yeah. So there may be lots of questions. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A. I'll keep going. So board structures are the third area in our framework for how a board manages itself. And here are policy areas, and we've touched on some of this already, is about committees, officers, and meetings. Do we have everything articulated to make sure those function smoothly? Our executive committees and, sorry, our executive members and their roles. Sorry, let me go back. So do we have a terms of reference for all of our committees? Are the roles of all of the committees really clearly articulated? Do executive officers, so the chair, the vice chair, or the president, the vice president, the secretary, the treasurer, all those roles, are they clearly supported with good job descriptions? Do we have clarity around boards and committee meetings, how they happen, when they happen, why they happen, and then somebody asked a great question around records and the secretary. Do you have a records management policy as a board? I have spent time as an interim ED in virtual, like for virtual organizations, and have worked in physical organizations. And from my perspective, it's really hard to stay on top of your records when you don't have a physical space. So really important to be clear around records management, minutes, where all your documentation is kept as an organization. And then your annual general meeting. And again, do we have clear policy around how that happens, when it happens, where it happens, what the agenda looks like, et cetera. All right. So getting into some of the details. How can board meetings be conducted to help facilitate good discussion? We had some conversation about that 2 weeks ago in terms of setting up an agenda. to enable discussion regarding priority topics. Others may have some good ideas. Please put them in the chat. What can your board do to improve the quality of board discussions and board decisions? And again, if you have ideas to share with your colleagues, I invite you to put them in the chat, and we'll take some questions as we move through this section. So tips for effective meetings, something that you hopefully can put in place in your policies or in your processes. An annual board work plan. So this would be on a piece of paper. When do we meet? How frequently? What are the fixed agenda items? What's the board education topic for every board meeting? And a board meeting may happen once a month. It may happen once every 2 months. It may happen quarterly. Regardless, for each one of those meetings, people know what the plan is. We know what our meetings are going to look like and what our agenda items are. Using a consent agenda, talked about that last time, rather than at every meeting spending a lot of time on routine items and matters, to be able to share all of that information in advance with the board, and with one motion approve everything that needs to be approved very quickly, so that you can move on to really important board functions, which is the next item. And somebody's asked that, right? The accountability piece. So decision supports how having at your board meeting as a part of your board package, tools that are going to enable the board to make decisions, and tools that are going to enable the board to do oversight of the organization's performance. And so when I talk about decision supports, that's more, what's our decision-making policy? Do we vote? Do we do consensus? And be really clear so we don't have to try to remember every time we come together how that works and what we need to make decisions about. And then our tools for performance oversight. So organizations have a strategic plan. Yes, super. Organizations have operational plans. Yes, super. And they're connected, right, to our strategic plans. And organizations have key performance indicators or metrics that they want to be measuring. Yes, super. Then, do we have a tool that very quickly we can look at that shows us as boards that we're making progress? Or if we're not making progress, what the plan is, right? And how the staff is, what strategies the staff is putting in place to help improve performance on a particular target. And so some organizations use dashboards, and a dashboard is like strategic priority, goal A, objective A, red, green, yellow. How are we doing on that objective in terms of where we expected to be at this point in time? So if you're using a dashboard, great. Let me know if it's working for you. It may be an Excel spreadsheet where the ED brings to the board's attention every meeting some key metrics, right? So we have a target of I don't know, what's a good target of if you're a settlement service organization, we have a target where 80% of all new clients have a case management plan in place, right? So your ED may report to the board at every meeting where you're at relative to that 80% target. So the important part is that the board is performing their oversight function. They do get reports. They have the opportunity to ask questions, and they are confident, right, that the organization is doing its due diligence in terms of monitoring its progress. So those are important tools to have in place. If you do have committees, as I said already, hopefully the committees have a terms of reference. It's very clear what they're responsible for or not responsible for. As I said way back at the beginning of the session, committees do not make decisions. They bring recommendations to the board. So we want to have really efficient processes at all our board meetings for any decisions that need to be made based on a committee's recommendation. And so you'd have time in your agenda, right, to respond to any committee work. Really important, as I said earlier, chair's role should be understood and should be respected by the board, and the chair should understand and respect their role. So this is really important that both parties understand. The board as a whole needs to recognize the chair's role, and the chair needs to own their role. Code of conduct, and we'll get into that in the next section under culture. Really important to articulate how it is expected that meetings will function. That people, for example, are very self-aware of how much space they take up in a meeting, that they don't talk more than is necessary, right, to ensure that the business that's on the agenda can get addressed in a timely manner. And in-camera policy, really important, again, to have a policy that's really clearly articulating when you move into in-camera as a board, when you ask the staff to leave. And back to our documentation, how you document those discussions, where any decisions that get made in those discussions are housed. Okay, so a little bit about record keeping. Your organization may be virtual. You may have a physical corporate office. You may be meeting virtually. You may be meeting in person. Understanding your records requirements is really, really important. Please, as one of like the long list of policies to put in place for your board, ensure that you have a records policy or a documentation policy in there. Having good governance, having strong administrative processes will prevent a lot of challenges or potential risks down the road. It does help you to maintain all of your requirements. It does help you to maintain corporate history. So as new chairs and new CEOs come in, all of that documentation is available to people. Doing so will help you to mitigate any risks. In the chance that there are legal issues, you'll be prepared. All of your documentation is at hand. Going right back, right, to that question around how to deal with somebody who doesn't show up for meetings, good documentation is really, really important. And so just a few tips here. These are some of the reasons, again, to be looking at documentation. You have requirements under Income Tax Act, under CRA. You have requirements probably in your bylaws to have a book somewhere, right? A record of minutes. And there's probably all sorts of other requirements where it would be important to have strong documentation policy and procedures that might be related to things like EI or CPP, or your funders may want you to have all sorts of documents available to them as a part of funding applications or a part of certification processes. And then I mentioned decision making. So I think I've talked a few times about the board. The board is a collective. The power of the board is that it comes together as an entity. And of course, the people on that board are really, really important. The stronger the individuals, the stronger the collective. However, it is really important to remember at all times that the board functions as a single entity. It has one voice, and no single board director or committee, and this includes the chair, can make a decision or act for the board without the expressed approval of the board. And therefore, that's why having so many of these policies is in place, because you also don't want to hold up the ED or hold up the chair in their work. If there's policies and procedures and directives in place, that makes it it makes it easier for the chair to, for example, speak to the media about a particular issue, because they know the rules of the game and what they're allowed or not allowed to say. So that is something to get really clear about. As a board, you operate with one voice. Your policies, your procedures are going to inform the decisions that you make. And so back to your agendas being and your meetings being structured so that they can enable the board to make the decisions that it needs to make. and that you have access to information that supports key decision points. Really important if you have decisions, again, be really thoughtful about your agenda and don't leave them to the end of the meeting. People typically are trying to rush out of a meeting at the end and are no longer in the headspace for those important conversations. So do get those important decision points up front in a meeting, and that's why we also recommend the consent agendas. Consensus. I hope everybody understands consensus, but just in case, I did want to put it in here for everybody. Consensus does not mean that a decision is unanimous, that everybody is excited about it and fully behind it. It does mean that the board of directors will live with the decision. I can live with it. I'm going to vote or support this decision because it may not be ideal, but it's the right decision at this time, or it's good enough at this time. So really important to understand consensus. And in your board policies and procedures, you may not use consensus, you may use a vote process. If you are using consensus, use it the right way. There is value in using it. You do have, again, hopefully really strong skills and experiences and knowledge sources at your board in terms of your directors. And a consensus process does really help to bring different perspectives to bear during the discussions that are needed for a decision. Sometimes a vote doesn't necessarily enable that. Toolkits. I think last time people may have asked a question about committees. Committees are important. You're not often doing, especially if you're a more developed board, you're not often doing work at board meetings. Your committees are put in place to do the more detailed work. But there's no hard rule around committees either, just as there isn't for many things. It is all about each organization reflecting on its needs and then structuring committees to meet those needs. We all have capacity limitations, so I think we should be really thoughtful and not create all sorts of committees that we don't have the capacity to support. And so usually what we'd find in organizations is we have a governance committee. That committee might be responsible for governance, like all of the policies and procedures. It may also be responsible for nominations, recruitment, right? And the quality of the board. You'd have a finance and audit committee that would take responsibility for everything that has to do with finance. May or may not also be the resource development committee if you have to do substantive revenue generation. And then some organizations have an exec that also is responsible for the quality of the organization's work. So it may be the committee that works most closely with the ED to establish the key performance indicators and establish the metrics for the organization and help the ED and the board to monitor the organization. So be really thoughtful about those committees. And again, they report up to the board. And if there's decisions, the board makes those decisions. And just a little bit more to some tips for committees. I've mentioned terms of reference. If they're standing committees, they're standing. I would say be thoughtful about whether you need a standing committee or a time-limited committee. There's a lot of work that doesn't need to be a standing committee. It could be very much we need to meet for 3 months and make this happen and identify 2 or 3 volunteers, and then their work ends after they achieve a particular set of objectives. In terms of questions earlier about volunteer recruitment and retaining volunteers, sometimes having time-limited work groups does help to keep people involved and engaged and interested because they're not on these committees that seem to go on, but nothing really happens at them. Standing committees should be chaired by a director that would report back to the board as a whole. Sometimes organizations bring external people onto their committees. It is a great way to recruit potential board members. That's a thought. ED, board chair, typically ex officio on all committees. Staff support on any committee does become managed by the ED, so it wouldn't necessarily be the chair that is managing a staff that gets attached to their particular committee. Important to review committees, just as it is important to review and evaluate the board as a whole. And again, looking at membership on your committees as part of your succession plan as a tool. A chair of a committee may become the vice chair of the board over time, etc. So I'll stop here. Questions about this section, structure, committees?
None about structures or committees, but we do have several questions about establishing policies and creating policies to retain board members or recruit board members.
Okay.
But we also, it is 11:32, so there's about 28 minutes. And Tony has a question.
Sorry for being late because I had an unscheduled meeting that threw me off, and the information that I'm listening to is so valuable. Thank you very much. The question is surrounding our structure. We are an operational board right now with impacting communities, and we want to get to a policy board.
Yeah.
And the idea of having the operational board is to be able to utilize the expertise of the board members to help with the overall, in terms of planning, in terms of decision making surrounding, for example, data. We have a data analyst who is on the board, and the data analyst is helping us to structure some of our surveys and helping us in gathering, and analyzing the data. So my question is, how do you transit from an operational to a policy board?
Yeah, with a plan, I would say for sure, and recognize it's going to take a while. So I have lots of questions for you when I think about that example, and your example, I think can be, there's lots of different contexts, right? Where you have members on your board who have strong data analysis skills. As an operational board, maybe you don't have policy people in-house as staff. And so you need the board to do the analysis so that the board can understand if its KPIs are being achieved over time or not, and how to potentially shift things. As you move, I mean, there's different things that need to happen, right, for you to move to a policy board. It's hard to move to a policy board if you're not replacing operational activities that have been taking place at the board level and with staff, right? Like at some point in the transition, the organization has to build up the revenues to secure staff to do that work in-house, and as part of operations, as part of service delivery. So that has to happen, and then at the same time, the board starts to do its work, and it learns how to go from being involved in policy analysis operationally to looking at data analysis operationally to looking at data reports. So usually as the policy board, I would receive a report, as I said earlier, that is very clearly telling me how my organization is performing in terms of a metric. And as the board member, if we're doing great, right? Like if our goal is 80% and the report says 80%, then we're celebrating and we're congratulating the staff, and everybody's going to feel very good. If we're not at 80% as a board member, again, like I'm not doing the analysis, and I don't even necessarily challenge the analysis, but I have the opportunity to ask questions like, give me some more information. Why haven't we been reaching this metric? Is it one-off? Is this a trend? What does the board need to know about our environment that might be impacting the organization's capacity to deliver, right? So as you build up your organization so that your staff are doing the data collection and the data analysis and the reporting to the board has to change its approach and still use its expertise, but ask different questions and provide different supports. Does that help, Tony?
Okay. Yes, yes, it certainly does. It certainly does. And the whole idea of setting up a plan, if we were to design a plan, um, can we get some feedback on the plan for the transition?
Is that a question to me, or is that
Yes,
just
to you,
something?
to you. So I was asking, like, oh, so how do, like, if we create a plan, we would like to get some feedback on the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
suggest, I wouldn't be available after today. I'm going to share as many tools as I have with you, but I would have suggestions in terms of, I said earlier, don't reinvent the wheel. There's 60 people on the call. If you have experiences, tools, templates that you can share with each other, share them, right, Tony? Because then you can reach out to colleagues and ask what their plans looked like as they went from, or what their experiences were as they went from being an operational board to a policy board. I'm not sure which sector you're in, or maybe this is something OCASI wants to think about. I come across it all the time, like operational boards trying to get to being a policy board. And do you need a community of practice around that, right? Like some like more formal way that the organizations that are specifically experiencing this transition can come together and support each other and share tools. Because that's what it is. It's like working through the process together, and it is a journey and it is a process, and you're not going to get there in a month or 2 months, right? You have to be ready to invest the time and the energy that it'll take to get there.
Thank you very much.
Should I keep going? Yep. Okay.
Yep, just to keep on time and yes, to
Yeah.
ensure that you have a little bit of a Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. So we have one more like section of our framework to go through. So this last area of the framework, board culture, and this again back to the 4 ways that the board manages itself, right? And so we've talked about the board role and function. We've talked about board quality, board structure, and now board culture. And here the policy areas to pay attention to: code of conduct, corporate responsibility, conflict of interest, really important, confidentiality, very important. And so as you're reflecting on your own organizations, these are a couple of questions you may want to start to think about, or maybe you're already thinking about them. What are the key characteristics of the ideal culture for your board? And why are positive relationships among board directors important? If you have ideas, of course, put them in the chat. It's really great to hear from each other. Okay, so some tips for board culture. When we have a positive culture, a healthy culture, just as we would expect that in our organizations amongst the staff, we want that on our board. It does contribute to maximizing individual performance. It maximizes the board's overall performance, and definitely minimizes, just like, let's just be very clear, we don't want bad behavior at our board meetings, right? So does minimize bad behavior to have a strong board culture. And that starts back to recruitment and orientation. We've talked about how important this is over and over again today. Your governance committee or your nominations committee, whoever's responsible for this, right from the get-go, does have a responsibility for discussing expected behaviors with board members, prospective board members. That includes attendance. It includes adherence to our fiduciary obligations that we talked about last time we met, and it's about behaving in a way that aligns with our values as an organization. And for people who are going to be involved in subsequent workshops that OCASI is hosting probably on strategic planning coming up at some point, where you would discuss mission, vision, values. Values, from my perspective, are deal breakers. A small number of values, and they're critical. And so ensuring that every board member understands that values are non-negotiables for an organization is important. Code of conduct and conflict of interest policies, have them, adopt them. So don't just write them down, make sure they're approved, make sure they're understood either at orientation or at a dedicated session. You review them with the board members, and then they're enforced, right? So that may be my preference is we all take responsibility for enforcing our policies. We don't want everything to go to our chair. And so we hold each other accountable for our code of conduct, especially, and for our conflict of interest policies. Relationships. It's really important to build trust. It's really important to have a collegial board. And so thinking about your board meetings and how to build in opportunities to build trust and make them like good experiences and places where people want to be. And it may be by doing like a fun exercise at the beginning or at the end of a board meeting. It may be by scheduling some retreats throughout the course of a year, treating board members to a dinner, something that enables you to really build up relationships and trust with each other. And of course, when there is bad behavior, as in your code of conduct is not being adhered, and if the board members, like in the moment, have not been able to correct behavior, the chair is responsible for addressing any issues that come up with a particular board member. Code of conduct. So I talked about the board as a collective being responsible for its management and its conduct. So that includes making sure that you, again, are aware of all your legal obligations and that you are adhering to them in the way that you behave. And so I'm thinking about harassment policy, harassment legislation we have in Ontario, accessibility policies we have in Ontario. Boards really need to understand those and make sure that their policies and procedures and practices align with those. As a director, we talked about fiduciary responsibilities last time, acting honestly, acting in good faith, being loyal, being obedient to the best interests of the corporation. And so it is important for organizations to have those conflict of interest policies and ask at every meeting whether a person is in a conflict of interest position at any time. And really important from my perspective, even if you think there's a tiny little possibility that you're in a conflict of interest position or that somebody else thinks you're in a conflict of interest position, you raise it. The best approach is to be transparent and err on the side of caution. So this has a lot of words on it. This is a sample code of conduct that you may want to use in your organizations. And you don't need to read it before every meeting, but it can go out as an attachment with the agenda. The chair may refer to it just in their opening remarks, and it includes some really important things. Conflict of interest, being on time, reflecting a positive public image and not behaving in a way that reflects poorly on the organization, being a good role model, stay focused on agenda, right? These are all some of the things that could make their way into your organization's code of conduct for board members. And depending on your organization, you may have other items that you put in, and some of these may not be relevant. All right, so I'll pause here and let's open it up to questions or discussion, ideas.
All right. So I don't know if anyone from the chat wants to ask any of the questions that they've been holding on to this entire presentation.
You can put your hand up if you have a question.
Yes. If not, I will go over various themes of questions that were asked. Wait,
Actually,
you have one.
I do have a question. I was trying to look for the raise button. I don't know if I can
Bars.
go.
Yes, we'll have Ali go first and then Maria.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. My name is Ali Kaveri, and I do work for the Center for Black Development Options. Mine is particularly I don't know if I miss it by any chance. Sometimes what I've actually noticed is that when you bring on board, I mean, like when the board is formalized, they tend to take so much position and influence that also supersedes the operations team, and that includes even the founding team. How would you navigate a situation where the board sort of overrides and they use so much influence without, you know, taking into consideration? Because at some point they need to sort of be regulated, but also to know the boundaries.
Yeah.
I know, yeah. So I just needed maybe some bit of clarity around that, because I've seen that with most boards that they come and then they want to sort of override things. And yeah, I don't know your thoughts around that. Thank you very much.
I have lots of thoughts. So we talked about that earlier in the presentation today. I'll just go back through it. And it's all this. It's your executive limitations and your separation of duties. It is, if a board is formal, it should have policies and procedures that are written down and that every board member signs off on, right? Like agrees to, signs off on. It's a condition of their participation in the organization. And one of the most, from my perspective, one of the most important policies is the executive limitations policy, which does and should articulate what is, in some ways maybe it should be called the executive, what's the opposite of limitations? Executive powers policy, right? Because it articulates what is within the executive, and the executive is the ED or the CEO or the highest staff person in the organization. So what is within their power to do independent, autonomously? Where do they have decision-making authority? Where do they have scope, right? And you very, very clearly articulate that. And at that point, the board does not move into that space. The board stays in its space, right? We have our swim lanes. And so then so those are your policies. This chart may be helpful because it, in a really clear way, lays out who does what, right? And so this may change depending on the organization, but if it should be pretty clear that, for example, the board, as I said earlier, the board may approve a budget, but they don't prepare that budget. They can ask questions, but at the end of the day, it is the ED's responsibility to put together a budget that they are confident will enable the organization to achieve its goals, right? Achieve its strategic priorities, use its funding responsibly. And then the board is responsible over the course of the year for monitoring the ED in the way that they are adhering to the budget that they've approved and monitoring the organization's performance. So this is the budget you presented. You said it would be spent accordingly, and you said it would enable us to achieve our goals. I'm reviewing our financial statements every month. Great, you're right. You are sticking to the budget. And I'm reviewing our dashboard and we're meeting our targets. Great. If that isn't happening, then the board does have a responsibility to not supervise, but evaluate the ED's performance. And it can do that and ask the questions, right, about the areas maybe that it's not satisfied with based on evidence, right? But this is the way to get there, is to really clearly articulate your executive limitations or executive powers policy and and clarify duties of the board, your committees, and the ED. I thought you were going to go in a different direction though. So I just wanted to say around community, right? And community, being a board that authentically represents the community. You may be a policy board and you may be a closed board. You can still have very, very strong community engagement. And you do that by articulating a strong community engagement policy and set of procedures. And that could involve community advisory committees, community people on your board, right? How many seats are on the board? Doing really, really strong program evaluation and program planning that's evidence-based. So being a policy board, being a closed board doesn't mean that you are not obligated to be very, very strong in terms of community engagement and really understanding and responding to community needs. So who was the second question?
Maria.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentation. My question is around succession planning.
Yep.
I want to know if you can share any tips on best practices for succession planning. I've been through a situation. I'm part of a board that a few months ago went through a succession planning that kind of like fractured the board a little bit because conversations were happening individually with board members, and that created a sense of like distrust or mistrust. And I wonder what are the best practices for doing this? Because even though like it's, just kind of like another process, it can be something like very simple. I think it's very complicated at the same time, managing all these different personalities in the board, and like what goes behind closed doors, like that sense of like creating a little bit of animosity between board members. So yeah.
Yeah, you've introduced so many different ideas that just in your scenario. So you need a succession plan. However, I'm just going back to the quality of the people at the table, right? And how important it is to recruit the right people and to be really clear around code of conduct, right? We don't have side conversations. We work through our terms of reference as committees. So one policy or process or procedure by itself, maybe it's not so impactful, but if you have a strong foundation, and that's why it's a framework, right? With these 4 components, if you can, and I appreciate it's not going to happen overnight, but if you can slowly like chip away at it, it does help over time to establish a really strong and cohesive board and organization. So back to those specifics around succession planning, I mean, immediately I think of who's responsible, like in terms of a committee? Do we have a governance committee? Is the governance and membership, like you need a committee, so it has to sit somewhere. And is the terms of reference for that committee very clear in terms of how it develops its succession plan, and then how it communicates its recommendations to the board, and then the recommendation to the board in terms of any particular succession plan. When it is a committee, it can introduce its process. So some of the things that are helpful to talk about is we're going to assess our board skills and competencies and gaps, and identify some of the immediate gaps that we need to fill and some of the long-term gaps. So that might be more around what kind of roles do you need on the board. And then if it's more, I don't have the details, but if it's more about different people vying to be the chair, I'm not sure, right? Like who wants to chair this organization? Having a process is important. So it'd be like a chair has to be back to like our executive committee role description. So have a role description. How long does a person need to be on the board before they're the chair? Do they need to be the vice chair before they're the chair? Can they be the chair for more than 1 year, right? Term limitations for all executive roles. You're not a chair in perpetuity, right? So having these policies and processes in place can start to take away some of that stuff that happens when there's room, right? Like when there's no policies, then there's room to start doing stuff that people want to do because it's their personal perspective or opinion. So getting us clear around the different roles, what the rules are for the roles, what the process is for being in the role, that you have to, if you're once you're not the chair, you're an ex officio member of the board for a year, right? So there's all sorts of conditions that become attached to different roles, and having those in place starts to make the process a bit more smooth.
Thank you very much. This is very helpful.
All right, maybe one more question.
Mildred.
Thank you so much for this workshop, and the information is very valuable. And I'm learning so much about all the different opinions and also the information presented. So my question is, how do we go about the strategic planning, training, or workshop with OCASI moving forward? As we want to guarantee sustainability in our operation for the following 10 years. So also we would like to know how do we engage in the charity registration with the CRA, as we are registered as a non-for-profit, but we don't appear in the list of charity yet. Please.
So I think you have a strategic planning workshop coming up. I'd suggest you attend that because that'll cover everything about strategic planning, and it's its own workshop. I can't talk about it in a minute. And same with, I'm assuming the finance workshop is going to address charitable status, hopefully. So definitely attend that one as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I will attend for sure. Thanks.
All right. I saw there's a couple more hands.
Yodit.
Thank you very much. I just have a question about, where an ED ends up doing most of the board's work, mostly because of capacity and operational pressures. And over time, the board becomes accustomed to the ED drafting policies, taking minutes, so being the secretary, preparing the strategic plan, writing the annual reports, and handling most governance related tasks. And so, even though the board may still be very strong at reviewing, asking questions, approving, or requesting amendments, but when it comes to actually producing work themselves, it takes a very long time. And so, effectively, almost equating to not getting done. So, how do you shift a board from being primarily reactive, reviewers to actively fulfilling their governance and working responsibilities? What are the best ways to build the board members' capacity and accountability and confidence so that they can meaningfully contribute rather than relying heavily on the ED, which makes the power dynamic sometimes a little bit harder to navigate as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have an easy answer for you. I think this is the attention in lots of organizations that are trying to do like good work, right, in terms of the board and put in place all of the policies and procedures and processes that are needed, because at the end of the day, it is a voluntary board and they have X number of hours to commit. And if they are a policy board, they are focused on oversight and monitoring. And I think there is an expectation that the ED through the staff are going to support them to do that work. In many of the organizations that I work with, if the board is putting together a strategic plan, we go the next step and we create a high level roadmap that includes resourcing. So for every priority, it's almost like you're double checking. Is this going to get done in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? Can it be done with our existing resources? And the ED or the CEO has to be like very straightforward, right? Around, I can do this. And like we as the organization can do this. We cannot do this unless we get outside support. And I think it's perfectly acceptable to say we need to secure like consulting expertise or some sort of like like support to help lift up some strategic projects. For the more routine, like the reality is lots of organizations will assign some sort of executive role, executive support role to support the ED with the board, because it is in terms of like the ED's job description, very often a core part of that job description is be the operational arm of the board, right? And you do spend a lot of time supporting the board. So the ED has to have their own administrative support systems in place so that they can delegate as much as they can to that trusted resource within the organization. But it's challenging when you're small and you do not have a lot of capacity. And then at that point, I think it's to be as honest as possible around what's in terms of prioritizing tasks and activities.
All right. Well, we are past time. So as I put in the chat, if for any questions that we are unable to answer right now live, please put them in the chat and we'll make sure they get sent to Sonia. So now I will give it to Yasin for closing remarks.
Wow, such a great presentation. I think it was very insightful, practical, and also inclusive. A lot of questions raised. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sonia, for such an engaging presentation. I personally learned a lot. And also, I would like to thank our excellent translators, Mercedes and Janitza, and also our technical team who supported and helped us make this training happen. So our next training, that is financial management under this webinar series that will be delivered in May 27. You will receive a registration link very soon. Please make sure to get registered. As you exit the Zoom, there will be, a survey will launch. Please make sure to complete the survey, because your responses are very important for us to plan our next sessions and make them more relevant for the future. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and enjoy the remaining of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.